Hello and welcome back to the Building HVAC Science Podcast, where it's our goal to create better, more knowledgeable HVAC and building performance technicians by helping the two professions to better understand each other with the ultimate goal of making customers happy in the homes they live in and the buildings they work in. In this episode of the podcast, Eric dives into my recent 2-week trip to Africa, covering my time in Kenya and Tanzania. The discussion we get into is really rich with cultural insights, unique experiences, and even some lessons in building science, maybe just some comparisons, maybe not so much lessons. But I share my observations of local architecture, sustainability practices, and really the warmth of the people I met, all against this great, tremendous backdrop of Africa's breathtaking landscapes and abundant wildlife. We're going to have a feature presentation, a video presentation of this conversation available shortly on the Trutech Tools YouTube channel. You'll find it under the featured videos, and there's a link in the show notes. Some of the highlights talk about some of the climate and seasonal patterns near the equator, where temperatures remain pretty mild, and the length of the day only varied slightly, in contrast to other areas where we do work, where our customers and we ourselves do work. So a lot of open air, sustainable structures designed for natural ventilation and comfort without reliance on any kind of mechanical systems. Also talk about some of my encounters with wildlife, from giraffe to lions to hippos and wildebeest, and sometimes just steps away from our vehicles or our accommodations. And then some reflections on cultural humility, local hospitality, and the contrast between rural simplicity and modern amenities. I close with a quote from our local guide about life in rural areas. I'm going to let you listen to the episode, or if you want to sneak ahead and grab that quote from the show notes, you're welcome to. But tune in. Here is Eric interviews me on my trip to Africa in terms of general topic of farming ideas versus farming the land. Reflections from another continent.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to, I don't know what this is. This is a recording of Bill and I and Bill's observations from another continent. So welcome to the Trutech Show with Bill and Eric.
Yes.
Is that what we're calling this now?
That's what we're going to call it, the Trutech Show. Trutech Live.
Trutech Live, but recorded.
But recorded. A lot of people take liberties with that word live. So
also possibly Building HVAC Science Podcast as well.
Yeah, we'll do that too.
This is just going to be a whole thing. So you can watch some of this on YouTube. You can listen to it on the podcast. If you're on the podcast, you might want to jump over to YouTube because Bill's got some pictures.
Yep.
Let's set this up here. You and your wife took a trip to Africa?
That's correct. Yeah, it was a bucket list thing. We're getting to that age where we got to check off before we kick off the bucket.
Try to empty that bucket before you leave the bucket?
Right.
You don't want to kick it overall entirely?
Nope.
No, we don't want that. Well, that's cool. So you guys took a trip over there. I imagine a long flight.
Yeah, it was 14 and a half hours for the long leg of it, from New York to Nairobi, Kenya, the capital city.
And specifically, you were in mostly Tanzania and Kenya?
Yeah, I'll show a little map of our course, but I would say 2/3 of the time in Tanzania and 1/3 of the time in Kenya.
All right, let's get into this. And we're going to talk a little bit about the local area, maybe some of the things you saw. But we're going to get into some building science because they have some different buildings over there than maybe what we're used to in North America, and some different thought processes. And imagine that a different climate.
Yep.
Let's take a look here at this map.
So I think you can see the cursor there if you're watching, but start off in Pittsburgh, PA. That's the gold star on the left of the map. And then the gold star on the right of the map is crossing over just below the equator, anywhere from like 1 degree above to 2 to 3 degrees south of the equator is where we spent most of the time. And that orange line across the screen is the equator. So across the North Atlantic Ocean and then through the continent of Africa on one very long haul flight over there.
That is a long haul flight of 14 hours. I hope you got to get up and stretch your legs once in a while.
Yeah, we did upgrade our seats to business class, I got to say. And we have that privilege, which we used to make the flight more enjoyable and be ready to explore and experience the culture, the climate, and the people.
Gotcha.
So speaking of climate, it is a tropical climate. and there are very distinct wet and dry seasons. We were in the short rain season. There is a long rain season at the beginning of the year, and then the rest of the year is called the dry season. The short rain season is usually morning to midday. There'll just be a real heavy downpour, and then that's it. And the long rainy season is just that. There's just long, continuous rains that affect vegetation and wildlife. And it was hot, but not like super hot. Again, we were there in October and November, early November, but it's the equator. So it doesn't change much. You see, I looked at the variation in sunrise and sunset for another reason, but it only varies like 5 to 10 minutes a day, sunrise to sunset.
All across the year.
All across the year, yeah.
Wow. I guess they don't have daylight savings time there.
No, they don't. No, it's called EAT, East Africa time. That was the time zone we were in, which was first started off 7 hours time difference ahead. Then it was 8 hours ahead because in the U.S., people fell back an hour for daily savings. And then also the altitude made a difference. We were anywhere from, as I recall, 4,000 to like 7,500 feet in the areas we traveled. So that made some difference, especially in the nighttime temperatures.
EAT, did you get hungry going into that time zone at all?
Geez, I was born hungry, so that didn't impact me too much.
Fair enough. Good. Well, I hope you got to enjoy some good food while you were there.
Yeah, it was all very fresh, a lot of local foods, and very heavily influenced by British rule at one time and also by Indian immigration to help them build the railroads. They immigrated like 32,000 people from India to help build a railroad in Kenya to Uganda back in the late 1800s. And the people stayed, they married. So there's a lot of influence of Indian culture and Indian food, especially.
Well, that should make for some interesting local cuisine. That's one of the things I like to do when I travel is find local cuisine. It's always interesting to see what different places have.
For sure.
One other thing I wanted to ask, what temperature range in Fahrenheit, obviously, because they probably measure everything in Celsius there, I'm guessing.
Yeah, they do. In Fahrenheit, maybe as like low as 59, and the high was like the mid 80s. I don't think it ever hit 90.
That's not bad. How about humidity?
It varied. Like if we were on Lake Victoria for a period of time, and as we got near the body of water, the humidity level went up. But otherwise, it was not noticeable. So sad. I didn't bring any instruments. I didn't bring a thermal imager. I'm kicking myself, not kicking, but regretting on the plane, not bringing a CO2 monitor.
I was going to say, you could have thrown in an Aeronet at least.
Thermal imager, yeah, all that. Dang it, didn't bring any of that. That would have been, especially thermal imager at night with the wildlife, because it gets dark there.
That would have been really cool to be able to just stick your head out and see what's going on. But I also understand, too, that this was a vacation. And sometimes you got to take a vacation from all that instrumentation.
Thanks. We've talked about that, too, right?
We have, yeah. Sometimes you got to take a break from all this stuff and realize that we survived without all of this for quite some time. And people still do.
Moving on here. So this is like a zoom in. So just going back real quick, we were hovered around the Kenya-Tanzania border. So that's where a lot of interesting stuff's going on. And then this is a map that I actually took a picture of it that was given to us by our tour guide. We went with a company called Road Scholar, just superbly well organized. And as you know, I like things that are well organized.
I'll vouch for that, yes.
This is the transit we took around the border of the two countries. And it was almost 8,000 miles from Pittsburgh, as not the crow flies, but as the airline flies. But these are our stops sort of labeled on the map: Nairobi, Amboseli, which is a national reserve, the city of Arusha, Tanzania, a extinct volcanic crater called Ngorongoro, the Serengeti, which a lot of people have heard of, the Great Plains, just millions of wildlife creatures are. Speke Bay, which is on the shores of the second largest freshwater lake in the world, Lake Victoria. First is Lake Superior. And then up to Masai Mara, which is part of a reserve over the Mara River. And that's where a lot of the National Geographic films where you see the wildebeest jumping off the hills into the river and the crocodiles attacking them, that's where that happens. But it wasn't happening right then. There weren't massive migrations, but there were some migrations. And then back to Nairobi. And so all these transits was just short of 1,000 miles of travel in 2 weeks. But the roads here, and I can't show a picture, or I actually have an audio recording, but I don't have it queued up, of what it was like to drive in the vehicles we were in on these washboard roads. Just very talented drivers. But some of these trips of 100 miles might take 4 hours. And of course, we were stopping to see wildlife. And then we did take a couple of small plane flights.
To me, when we looked over this, I saw these distances and I'm thinking, hey, that's not a lot of distance realistically for me, because if I jump on an interstate 80, 100 miles, that's all in a day's driving. I do a lot more than that sometimes. But to hear you say 4 hours for a trip, and you talked about speed, I think you mentioned to me you had a speedometer app on your phone.
Yeah, so I was like checking at different times. Really rough roads, like around 20 miles an hour. And then better roads, 50, 55 miles an hour. But they weren't really roads, they were trails. There were very little gravel. I mean, there were some roads, but when we got off the beaten path to where the wildlife is, we were literally on the beaten path.
And when you're saying roads, like paved roads versus gravel or just dirt 2-track?
There were few paved roads, I'll just put it that way. And some of them weren't in great condition either. That is the long and short of all the points that we hit. We did a lot of touristy things. We went to a snake preserve. It's a small boa that's wrapped around my neck there. We went to a place where they do research into giraffes and preservation of giraffes. If I recall correctly, there were around 150 of these Rothschild giraffes in existence in the world when they put in this giraffe conservation center. And now they are working very carefully. They're up to 900 giraffes that are now in existence. But we give them a little handful of food and we could feed them food pellets, feeding goats or something like that. Tall goats.
Very tall goats.
This is my lovely wife, Marilyn, and I standing at the top of one of the places we stayed, like the big open air restaurant room. And I'll show you a picture of that. So building science, some of these aren't buildings. They're just roofed in structures because year round, it's comfortable to be out, be in the open air. But that is Mount Kilimanjaro in the background there, which is one of the big attractions and the highest peak. And I think it's the highest peak in Africa. I may get some facts wrong here. So anybody who's out there fact checking me, have fun. And then, of course, wildlife. I got a few shots of wildlife. I mean, that's really a huge part of the trip. The antelope, the baby baboons, giraffes, just amazing. They're out in the wild. And elephants, of course, African elephants. There are no Asian elephants there because it's Africa. They're African elephants. And you can tell an African elephant, if you see one in the zoo, their ears are shaped like the continent of Africa. That's what we were told. And then this is a picture of Mount Kilimanjaro, but it's also a picture of some of the migration. And these are wildebeest that are just going. Sometimes the lines were like a mile long. They're just migrating. They just somehow instinctively know to move to fresher grazing lands. Very often they're mixed in with zebra and they protect each other. The zebra supposedly has, I believe it's better eyesight. The wildebeest has better sense of smell. So for predation, they protect each other, and the whole idea is safety in numbers. Somebody's going to get it, but it might not be you if there's a lot of you.
Yeah.
And just more wildlife, zebra like crossing the road right in front of us, Cape buffalo, ostrich, pumbaa, which is not the name from Lion King, but it is the name of the creature. The warthog is called a pumbaa in Swahili.
Huh. I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's a good representation, actually, where the zebra is at there of the type of roads probably that you're driving on a lot of times.
There you go. You can see the washboarding.
Potholes and everything else in there.
Yep. The wildebeest over here with the blonde beard. And just a couple more. Our guide mentioned this caracal cat, which is a really odd-looking creature with the pointy ears. They are very rarely seen, and they're also poachers like getting them because they make really interesting pets. And just coincidentally, I saw a news posting of a caracal cat found in Hoffman Estates, Illinois. That's near Chicago. In the wild, apparently got away, been poached and illegally imported.
Wow, that's a bummer.
Yeah. And then moving on to the physics here, there's a couple of pictures of wildlife keeping their cool. This was a lion. You got, of course, it's a lion. And they're called Simba, by the way, not because of Lion King, but in Swahili, that is their name, Simba. Just laying there in the shade, waiting and doing a lot of minimal motion. They really, lions, bigger creatures, conserve their energy and just do absolutely what's necessary. And the herbivores do a lot of feeding, and the carnivores just go for big kills and then slowly digest it. We saw many, many hippopotami. That may or may not be correct. Again, somebody please fact check me.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. But in the water, just spending all day in the water, then they'll come out of the water and they'll start grazing.
It's a good place to stay in the water, keep cool.
Yeah. And this is Toyota Land Cruisers, or what our primary transit vehicle was. Just taking a look at the picture there of the suspension, multi-leaf spring suspension. They drove them hard, but they were really skilled drivers. Four-wheel drive, of course. And you could sit up to 6 people inside. We only had 4 at a time, 4 passengers. And then the driver and the guide sometimes would be in our vehicle. But they also turn on the AC. The African air conditioning is open your window. So just slide those windows open and be ready for all the dust to come in.
Oh, man. I bet that was fun.
Yeah. One day I wore a mask because the dust was just really starting to get to me.
Yeah, that's interesting that even in those vehicles, they don't have air conditioning, but I imagine it's probably a lot of work to maintain those vehicles on those kind of roads when they're driving on that all the time.
And they say they keep them in service for like 5 years, this particular organization, and then they sell them because the repair costs start to go up there after 5 years on the road.
Did they say anything about how like it was to get parts and supplies and things like that for the vehicles in there?
Didn't ask about that. Saw a couple vehicles broken down, mostly tires. What you can't see, there are 2 spare tires. You can derive it from the fact there's one here on the left, and this is the mounting for the one on the right. So they're ready to blow 2 tires during the course of a week.
That says a lot about the quality of the roads there.
And the other thing you can see here is the snorkel. It could be for water, but I believe it's for dust.
Yeah, primarily, a lot of people will think those are for water fording, but primarily they are for dust because you get a little bit higher up, you get a little bit cleaner air. It makes that air filter last a lot longer.
And diesel, I don't know the size of the engine, but I do know it's 180 gallons of fuel, 2 90-gallon tanks.
Gallons or liters?
No. Sorry. Liters.
Okay.
Liters. Yes. Thank you.
I was just surprised they were measuring things in gallons there.
So as I mentioned, lots of open air buildings. So like the building science, there's no building there. It's just protection. So this was one little restaurant, just an outdoor table. And this was another one. This is where we were near the top of this building. And we looked out over the Serengeti. And at one point actually saw a monkey running around the framework up here on the building while we were in it. Just that's what happens.
So that looks like it would create a stack effect and give you some breeze in from the sides and pull it out the top in kind of a natural fashion.
Yeah, a lot of the buildings and huts and enclosures we were in were actually pretty comfortable. You acclimate after a few days to new temperatures for your body.
Yeah. And the other piece there is, too, it's keeping you out of the sun so you don't get that radiant heating effect. It's a natural shade or a man-made shade, but that definitely keeps people cooler.
And it also, the ground, the surface you're on is not being heated with radiance. So there's nothing like beaming up from beneath you like you would be if you're outside in the full sun.
Yeah, those nice, warm, radiant floors.
Yeah. This was a bar at one of the places we were at, but everything's open air. And then just wanted to point out the nature of the thatched roof, the materials, using a lot of natural materials that are there, grasses and sisal and things like that. And then again, I'm speculating here, but you can see like points of stack effect ventilation that at the top of this little cone or the pyramid at the right-hand side. And then this open air on the end wall on this hut here.
Yeah, and the other thing, too, is if those surfaces are really far away from us, they tend to radiate less. So that higher roof like that.
100%. They did mention that. It's like, why are these so tall? And it's because it actually, if they were shorter, the hot air would pack down, even inside a place that was open air. So some of the enclosed places, buildings had very tall roofs. And we saw some buildings under construction with very, very high peaks like that.
Well, that's one of the things that we look back even in North America at a lot of the older buildings that were built more for comfort rather than just keeping the weather out. A lot of them had high ceilings and they had ventilation at the top of the rooms. If we think about the old houses, right, they had the
Transom?
transom window. That's what I'm trying to think of. The transom window above the door to allow ventilation at that high level. And that would let hot air out. And you could open a window on the other side of the room on the low, and you get that cross ventilation in the space.
Exactly. Just using natural driving forces versus mechanical ones. And then we stayed in some semi-permanent tents. You call it glamping, but very, very nice, solid floors, but it was still a tent structure. And the idea that semi-permanent is some of the areas we were in, they require like every 8 or 9 years that they actually tear it down and let everything regrow because it is a conservation area, and then put it in somewhere else. So it isn't this thing that's constantly on site and constantly wearing, tearing. So then like the roads, the paths, everything grow back after a number of years. So there are actually conservation plans in place that impact how you live there.
I don't know. That looks like a tent I would be happy to live in.
Yeah, it was really very nice, very spacious. It was interesting when we wanted to take a shower. It was like, give us a call on the walkie-talkie and we'll come out and we'll run the hot water line to your tent. It'll need to purge for 2 or 3 minutes, then you can do the shower. But here are your hours to shower. Outside of these hours, you will probably not get hot water if you're okay with that.
They just heated it up at certain times of the day.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And the same for power, too. There were some of these tents all had power, but sometimes power would go out. And it was like, during the middle of the night, we're not going to run the generators in these remote conservation area camps. Or even in one of the main cities, Arusha in Tanzania, power went out several times. And it was just, I asked a question like, does this happen often? Yes. Why? Well, it's something in the system. It was like nobody like really, maybe they were just a little bit embarrassed about it, but that's just the way it is.
So it was more like the power for them was a luxury and they would just happily live without it.
Right. And adjusted their lifestyle to that. Speaking of lifestyle, we did see some little on the roads to places, there'd be truck stops. There's a lot of traffic from Mombasa, which we didn't visit, which is a Kenyan seaport. So a lot of goods are moving by truck from Mombasa into the country and into Tanzania. So there'd be truck stops along the way. And where there's truck stops, there's like little hotels, there's markets, there's trading, there's people, there's stores. But we would also see people carrying baskets of clothes to the river to wash them. And that's pretty commonplace.
Interesting. So there wasn't a lot of what we would consider modern appliances there. They were more using what they had on the land in a lot of cases. I'm going to guess that they probably don't live, most of those people don't live in tents like this either.
No, we have some pictures of those, like the more common housing coming up. This was like our housing. We were privileged to have this. This was another site we were at. These are more permanent tents at this particular. Of course, you can see the foundation being built up. This tent in particular, they said, please be sure to zip the zippers tight so the monkeys stay out.
That's probably good advice.
Literally their advice. I don't have a picture of it, but just opposite this porch, 10 feet away and down an embankment were hippos in a waterway 24/7. Well, not 24/7, all day long. And then at night, they would climb out, make some noises, and go feed on the grassy plains nearby. But we were literally in the middle of the zoo, so to speak.
Wow. I'm not so sure I would be interested in being that close to a hippo, but I guess if they left you alone.
A lot of the advice we got was don't get between an animal and their babies, their food, and water. Those are just like some of the highlights. And they're not going to be so naturally aggressive, except the rhino, which we didn't see any of because it's very rare to have a rhino sighting. But the rhino, I guess, is just more aggressive in general. But you can never be sure. I mean, they're wild animals.
Yeah. Interesting.
Again, looking up there at the ventilation concept between the tent.
So was that tent, did it have like a solid roof on the top of it as well?
Yep.
Well, I probably would have had to keep the monkeys out.
Right.
Because the monkeys would go over a wall like that.
This is the semi-permanent camp. You can see the tarping there. They're like no sidewalks, nothing like that. Just trails that I think they move the trails occasionally and they just clear them with a manual scythe. And this was, I think, shortly after arrival there. But again, this was the common room. There was a bar on the right-hand side. And this was just to show, like, again, that tent within a tent structure, the ventilation concept.
Not too dissimilar from the way we've built a lot of houses with our roofs over a ventilated attic or something like that over the top of it. But looks like they have a lot more ventilation openings than typically what we end up with.
Yes. Yeah. Tremendous. We did visit a school, and this is a classroom, just a pretty simple building. What I found interesting is they had biology painted on the walls for all the different organs of the body, the skin, and everything like that. And the children were all very attentive. And we did get to sit down and speak with them. A few of them got to present their names, their parents' names, and what they wanted to be growing up. I did find one girl who wanted to be an engineer. I sat down at her table. She understood very little English, but it was just fun to interact. So this is two sides of one classroom. We talked about how many kids there are in the classroom. I counted, quick count, 100. And that's what they told us typically. There's 100 kids for one teacher.
Wow. I'm guessing these kids are pretty engaged in learning then.
Yeah, they all seemed like really quiet, not distracted. When the members of our tour group went to sit down in their benches and speak with them, they were super engaged. A lot of chatter, a lot of interaction. It was really heartwarming.
Neat. Yeah, we don't see that kind of a ratio very much in North America.
We did see a few mini splits in some of the places we stayed. This was the place called Planet Lodge in Arusha, Tanzania. And you can see the mini split high up there in the wall. It was totally optional. I mean, they said, feel free to turn it on and close the windows up.
Is that powered by the solar on the roof then?
I don't know exactly. I don't think so. For some reason, I think the solar runs some of the fans, the ventilation fans that are in there, but I didn't see a battery on it. And again, I'm not sure what the solar was powering there, but your eagle eye caught the evacuated tube hot water.
Yeah, that's a little bit different system. We see some of that in the States, but not a ton.
So this was the hot water for our hut that we were in.
So evacuated tubes, which are vacuum evacuated tubes, and they have a fluid inside of them, and it boils and condenses as it transfers heat into that water up at the top. Pretty neat system. And they're lucky enough to not have to deal with freezing temperatures, unlike most of us in the United States that have to be somewhat concerned about freezing temperatures and freezing all that water and stuff outside. But yeah, that's a neat system. I'm guessing that's an insulated tank at the top then?
Yeah, it was.
And then you just turn it on. So they probably have some kind of an electric pump to move that around?
Right. I think there's a pump that pressurizes the water for the whole hut, or maybe like the whole system. There might be a well on the property, and then it just feeds into there, keeps that full, and then you use it as needed. Didn't really notice any inconvenience from that hot water. We used it whenever we wanted, but we were only there 2 days.
Did you notice any water towers? Because like a lot of our pressure comes from towers where they pump it up and then...
I did. I don't have any pictures of it, but I did notice water towers. Well, actually, maybe not correct on the material, like polypropylene tanks, big black tanks. And I saw those tanks, they were on trucks, like as big as they could fit on a truck. I believe it was for collecting rainwater and then putting that on the roof of a building or high in the air to then provide water pressure. The infrastructure water didn't seem to be very prevalent.
Gotcha. Not like we're used to.
Not at all.
I'm assuming sewage is probably similar. They probably have a lot of septic systems there, I would imagine.
Yeah, and didn't really see anything. So the places we stayed were very good at concealing that, whatever. The same hut we stayed in, again, Planet Lodge in Arusha, had nighttime ventilation, which they said you could either there was a mini split in the room, or you could run the nighttime ventilation. We tried that one night. It was okay. It looks very homemade there, but sort of like 2 computer fans in the base of the patio door facing out. And then on the right there, you can see what looks like a computer fan that's just mounted into the wall. And it ran continuously in the bathroom, just to keep, I guess, the moisture level down. That might have been running off of that solar panel, now that I think about it, because it does look like a DC fan.
Could be. They make those in AC as well, so...
That conduit, I think, is running right up to that side of the building where that solar panel was that we looked at. That one here.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
That's where the bathroom was.
That makes sense then.
And then different construction methods. So we saw a lot of buildings that looked like they were unoccupied. And something you and I discussed before, but in a lot of countries of the world, there aren't mortgages or people don't qualify for mortgages. They basically build when they have money. So a construction project may take 10 years to build your house, or you may build the first floor and then there'll be rebar shooting up to the ceiling where you're going to encase the next of it.
And then, of course, the slightly more traditional to the right.
Right. We're standing on a gentleman whose grandfather built this structure, just a totally in earthen building. His father built this hut where they lived, and then he built a more modern house all on the same property. And this is us standing on top of this, the opposite view of where we're standing on this structure here. And then this is going inside. This is where his grandfather lived.
Wow.
And many times, because of cattle rustlers and theft, they would keep animals inside the same hut they lived in. In fact, on Maasai village, we spoke with the chief. And as we were leaving the hut, I said, "What's this little area over here for?" And he said, "That's for the young cows, for the cows stay, and we get our milk in the morning." Like literally right from the animals it was goat's milk, sorry.
Goat's milk. Interesting. How tall is that? That does not look tall to me.
No, you had to stoop down to get inside.
If you had to stoop down to get inside, I really would have had a problem.
Yeah, you would have had to fold over. This is just a picture of these are the people who live off the land, the Maasai, their villages, the enclaves where they get together, and more of the naturally made housing materials that they use.
More just mud and grasses on the sidewalls?
Yep. Actually, that's the next picture is mud, grass, and cow dung is used to build these structures. They commented, this is looking at the side of the same building, but these go up in like 3 or 4 days with the help of your neighbors once you get the materials together. But the more like the concrete block, of course, you have to wait till you're able to buy all the block and finish it off.
So not a lot of blower door testing going on here, I'm guessing.
Nope, not at all.
Yeah, that might leak a little bit.
Yeah. And this was at one of the lodges we were at. This was on the shore of the bay of Lake Victoria. And you can see the ventilation in the roof line. These don't look so much like native made. There was some kind of tool used to cut the edges of this grass roof, but it's still a grass roof structure.
And a very modern window there, I might add, too.
Yeah. This, I actually thought of Eric when I took the picture on the left, because this was in a men's washroom at the border control facility going into Tanzania. I thought Eric would really appreciate the way they got this wired up.
Welcome to our country. Please electrocute yourself. Or not. It's a little scary looking from what I know about electricity. Both of those pictures are.
240 volt, the standard, if I had said already, British plug connections. And then this is, on the right was just power coming into a building. Everything's very, 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 very basic.
You made a comment to me earlier about something your tour guide said about that configuration coming into the building there, right?
Yeah, he said, yeah, it's very neat. It's all right there, right in front of you. Very straightforward.
And I have to agree, there's something to be said for simplicity, but that still makes the hair on the back of my head stand up a little bit. And
no guardrails on that.
I get a twitch.
And then I did see some solar being used. This was a fishing village we took a tour of, and they had solar panels to directly charge the DC powered or LED lights that they use for fishing at night, for on their boats and in the water for attracting the fish. So they did a lot of night fishing there. We actually saw them later on the water that night. And the lights, of course, at night go for quite a distance. But they just set these up and they have their names on the flashlights. And somehow I guess they share the DC power. Didn't really see much in terms of control or power conditioning there. Really not sure how that worked. Again, trying not to be too prying in our adventure.
Did you see a lot of solar electric? Is that pretty common there?
Nope. Too expensive, they said.
Too expensive. That's interesting.
A lot of sun available, but it's too expensive to really implement.
Very cool, Bill. I appreciate you sharing with everybody. What are some of the takeaways that you found from this trip? Because you're a very observant person and you like to find little things in places like this.
I think people were very trusting of each other, very friendly, but we did look different than everyone there. but we didn't feel out of place or made a spectacle of. Very appreciative of any small tip or indulgence, like a $1 tip really meant a lot to people. I think the buying power is like 5-1 or maybe more between what you could get here and what you can get there. So that was all very much appreciated. I think people went out of their way to be kind and accommodating. I think tourism means an awful lot.
Seeing some of that stuff and realizing that there's people still living in the world, to me, just seeing those pictures shows how really easy we have it sometimes.
Yeah, we talked before about this privileges versus entitlements and how you sort of have to keep that all in check. And I think that was a big thing for me. People were still happy, still thriving. Oh, there was one comment made by our guide, which really stuck with me. He actually spends part of the year on his mother's farm taking care of her cows. And his mother's 102, and he was like in his mid-50s or maybe mid-60s, but very good shape. Anyway, he said a lot of people do go off to the city and get attracted by the Western cultures. And that's great. Get a career, make a job, whatever like that. But a lot of people prefer to stay back in the farm, back in the village, just more or less subsistence, raising crops, raising animals. And the thing he said, which really got me, which is when you are on the farm, you are farming the land. You're interacting with nature. When you go to the city, the farm is in your mind. You are farming ideas. I thought, wow, what a resonating quote.
That's very insightful. I think that should just close this whole thing out.
I think it is, yeah.
We can't top that.
No.
Well, Bill, and thanks for showing and sharing with everyone. Thanks for everybody for following along and checking this out.
All right.
We'll see everybody on the next one.
Take care. Thanks again for listening to this episode of the Building HVAC Science Podcast. The Building HVAC Science Podcast is a production of Trutech Tools Limited. In full disclosure, I'm the owner of Trutech Tools. The opinions voiced are those of my guest, my co-host, or myself. And in this case, it was just my guest and myself. Well, my co-host and myself, actually. If you're in the market for some of the tools or test instruments that we talk about in the podcast, or just in general, take a look at what Trutech Tools, that's TRUTECHTOOLS.com, offers. You can use the offer code HVACBS for a nice discount. I want to thank you for listening and following us in the Building HVAC Science Podcast. If you could give us a rating, that would be fantastic. You can also reach out to us at marketing@TrutechTools.com with any questions, feedback, comments, or ideas for future episodes. We hope you enjoyed this episode today, and please consider coming back next time to listen to more of the Building HVAC Science Podcast. Take care.